Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I want to say to you again, our second show in a row this week, and StreamYard is acting up, and it is there's a delay in my movement in my mouth, and there's also a freezing in the pictures or whatever. It is not because of us. I'm telling you, this is StreamYard completely. I'm going to try to bring in our guest. Um, Professor Kevin Barrett in just a second. I just want to inform you that this happened on our show uh, day before yesterday. So if there's a lag time, please forgive us. We have no control over it. As you heard our guests on the other show say that every time they come on this show, um, the powers that be are always doing something to take away from the show and to try to stop the show. But that's what we're expecting in this time of censorship, great censorship. But beyond that, let me bring in our guest, and it'll be a delay before he gets on the screen for a second. Here we are. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing well. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Kareem to everybody out there.
Yes, Ramadan Kareem, Ramadan Mubarak, and Assalamu alaikum to you. And I just want to say this real quick. If there's a delay in our talk or whatever, that is because of StreamYard. They continue to tamper with the show. Um, and we were just using three different computers at the same time to see, and the other two computers were moving in real time. And then as soon as we uh, entered the studio on that one, it started doing the same thing. So we have no control over it. But I want to get to our subject today about what's going on in the world. Let's talk about the Ukraine situation at hand. What do you think that is actually going on between Russia, NATO, Ukraine, and the US? Because if you read or listen to Western media, they would have you think that Russia is being destroyed and they're incompetent and they are aggressive and there was no justification for Russia's reaction or moves toward in Ukraine or towards Ukraine. What say you on this matter?
Yeah, the Western media coverage of this is completely insane. I mean, it's almost like they're just trying to prove that Putin is right when he calls the West the empire of lies. Uh, and I mean, he is right, of course, but the empire of lies is doing everything it can to prove he's right by exaggerating their usual level of propaganda and mendacity to a whole new low. I'm amazed. I haven't seen this kind of mass hysteria based on lies since 9/11. I mean, even COVID, I'm not sure ever quite reached this point. All these big stories are told falsely by American and Western mainstream media, but this one, my goodness, it's just way off the charts. What's really going on here is that the United States declared war on Russia in 2008 by declaring that it was going to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And Russia said, no, no way, that won't happen. Here's a red line. The planet will go up in nuclear smoke before we let that happen. Because if NATO's right up there on the edge of Ukraine, it's a couple of minutes from a nuclear strike from Moscow. And you Americans have a first strike policy, and you make nothing but first strike weapons. And you have an official policy that you're going to be the first party to strike first when the inevitable nuclear war comes. You can't have Ukraine, period, yet. So they were very clear. And then the U.S., rather than being reasonable and coming to some kind of negotiated solution, went and overthrew the government of Ukraine in a CIA coup d'etat in 2014. So since 2014, Ukraine has been run by the CIA and its puppets. The CIA cultivates puppet oligarchs, and the current president is just the latest puppet of the oligarchs who are run by the West. It's just like Iran in 1953. The U.S. overthrew the government of Mossadegh and put in the Shah. The Shah was an American puppet. Everybody knew it. That government wasn't legitimate. And the same is true when they overthrew Arbenz around the same time in Guatemala. And they've overthrown dozens and dozens, by some counts, something like 65 or 70 countries since then, and installed their puppet governments. And so they did that in Ukraine in 2014. And again, the Russians said, no, you can't do that. And they quickly moved to host a referendum in Crimea, which is was part of Ukraine, but it's full of Russian speakers who like Russia. And so Crimea then joined the Russian Federation. But the rest of these parts of eastern Ukraine, the so-called Donbass region, that is friendly to Russia, it's populated by Russian speakers who totally rejected the 2014 CIA coup d'etat. That part of Ukraine then was attacked by the Ukrainian military, which has been shelling civilians and mass murdering civilians ever since. And Russia kept saying, this is unacceptable, this is unacceptable. And then under Trump, who was supposedly so friendly to Russia, yeah, right, the Americans started arming and training Ukraine. In other words, they made Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. Now, the Russians way back in 2008 said, no, we will blow up the world before we allow that to happen. You cannot do that. It's an absolute red line. It would be like putting Russian first strike weapon systems on the Canadian border, overthrowing the government of Canada, and putting a Russian puppet government that's run by Russia in Ottawa, Canada, and staffing it with Canadians who absolutely hate the United States. Would we allow that? Of course not. So the Russians said that you can't do that, but that didn't matter. The crazy neocon-run policy, and for some reason, these neocons who got us into Iraq and Afghanistan and who blew up the World Trade Center on 9/11, those people who've been totally shamed and embarrassed as their policies imploded, they're still in power, especially in Ukraine policy. So at that point, Putin finally delivered his ultimatum back at, I think, December, January, and then the West just said, forget it, thumbed its nose at Putin and didn't negotiate and refused to accept that this was an ultimatum. So the inevitable happened, and it was expected. The West knew it was coming. The West knew they had provoked the Russians to the point that Russia had no possible avenue left except to defend itself. And so the Americans, way back in December, and maybe even before that, they knew this war was coming because they knew they were provoking it. So what they did was they told their liquid national gas companies to take that natural gas that they were sending to Asia and redirect it to Europe, because they knew that what this was really all about was going after Germany and Europe and forcing them to buy extremely expensive American liquid natural gas instead of the cheap gas from Russia that they've been increasingly using. So this was all designed to destroy the Nord Stream pipeline and to take Europe and make it completely impoverished and dependent on the United States so that Europe cannot be independent. That's one of the main strategic reasons why the United States launched this war of aggression against Russia. And that's what it is. It's a war of aggression by the United States against Russia. There is no Ukraine. The so-called Ukraine with that stupid flag is a puppet state run by the CIA and the neoconservatives. And the media is lying to you because it's owned by the same neoconservative, neoliberal bunch of liars and scumbags who answer to the oligarchs who run the West. The West is not democratic. The United States has no democracy whatsoever. That's a myth. It's a big lie. We are an oligarchy run by the world's biggest scumbags and war criminals in history, vastly worse than Hitler, Pol Pot, or any other bad guy from history that you could possibly name. We're stuck in the belly of the beast, run by the most evil people in human history, and it's time we rise up and overthrow them by any means necessary.
Well, do you think that the U.S. in her plans to force Russia into this situation, do you think that now she has overplayed her hands, especially as Russia and China coordinated their policies, Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, and a few other nations, and now we see the world quickly de-dollarizing?
Well, I don't think Russia has overplayed its hand.
No, the U.S.
Oh, the
You think
U.S. Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. Yeah. Yes, I think that the U.S. has overplayed its hand. The strategy here is twofold. As I said, the main point of this war is to cut off Europe from Russian gas supplies and force them to buy the expensive American gas. So that's part of the economic war. But the larger economic war here and strategic war is that the U.S. is trying to destroy Russia, because the Russia-China alliance is becoming increasingly formidable with Russia's military power and technical innovation in military affairs, plus its energy power, plus China's manufacturing power. The Russia, China, Iran axis of independent countries in Eurasia has become a threat. to this global dominance by the so-called United States, really not by the people, but by the oligarchs. So they're trying to destroy Russia. And I think that's not going to work. The economic aspect of this is they think that by sanctioning Russia and turning the world against Russia and cutting the West off from Russia, that will lead to the destruction of Russia. That finally, there'll be some kind of coup, or people in Russia will rise up against Putin. The central government will go down, and Russia will break up into a bunch of little powerless countries that can be just raped and pillaged by the West, just like Russia was in the 1990s when it was run by the Western puppet, the Yeltsin. So that's their plan. But yeah, I think they bit off more than they could chew here, because China is the world's manufacturing hub, and manufacturing is ultimately the source of economic power, and especially the kind of economic power that matters in war. In World War II, the real victor was the United States. The United States defeated Britain and stole the property of the British Empire, both the colonies and the gold. And the United States, of course, contributed to the real fighting, which was Russia versus Germany, by its massive lend-lease aid to Russia. So the United States came out of World War II as the world's most powerful country due to its manufacturing power. And this time around, we're seeing World War III shaping up with Russia and China, and to some extent Iran, although we'll see where that goes, lining up against the United States. And now China has the manufacturing power. Russia has the raw materials. What does the United States have? The United States has a bunch of worthless paper. We've got the green paper that we trade for real goods and services, and that's what this war is really about. Is there the desperate, dying dollar empire is trying to find a way to force the world to keep accepting worthless green paper for real goods and services, and the Chinese and the Russians are saying no, and I think they're the ones who are probably going to win.
Well, on that note, why do you think that the European leadership is going headlong the bad policies of the states? They're publicly announcing we won't buy the natural gas that we need in rubles. This is blackmail, they say. But I mean, isn't that lunacy?
It is. Yeah, the Europeans are committing economic suicide by going along with the United States. And you might ask, well, why are they doing that? And I guess the answer is that they are occupied. Europe has been occupied territory since World War II. The United States military occupies Europe. That's what NATO is. NATO is just a euphemism for the US occupation of Europe. Europeans have no real power in NATO. The Americans completely dominate NATO. And by the Americans, again, I don't mean ordinary Americans. I mean the American oligarchs who control policy from the top down. So the Europeans, I think, there are some politicians like Marie Le Pen in France who may actually be an upset victor in the upcoming election. It wouldn't be a big surprise, who dissent from this policy. The leadership of Serbia, which is not in NATO, dissents from this policy. Viktor Orban in Hungary dissents from this policy. But the majority of European countries are ruled by pawns of these neoliberal bankster oligarchs. Now, the same oligarchy has power in the US and Europe and is trying to extend its power. So they're the ones who tell the Europeans what to do. And then the American military and intelligence apparatus has the European leaders by the short hairs. They tap their phones, they cultivate them. The European leaders are brought up in these American empire or Western empire institutions. Klaus Schwab picks the future leaders and so on. There are all of these institutions that keep Europe tied to this empire and force Europe to go along with whatever the empire says, even if that's totally suicidal economically, like this particular decision is. Now, the question is, will the Europeans continue even as they start starving and freezing and their economies are ruined and Germany's manufacturing shuts down because the energy is too expensive? Well, that remains to be seen.
Well, yeah, because that's economic suicide. I'll bring Rashid in just a second. That's economic suicide, especially for Germany, because Germany is the economic engine to Europe, and yet Germany is ignoring its own national interest and the will of the people by going along with America and siding with the NATO hawks against Russia. Do you think that, especially because of the way the atmosphere is in today's geopolitics, do you think that we're being pushed closer and closer to war? I'm talking about on the European continent.
Yeah, that's true. It's this war isn't necessarily going to be limited to within Ukraine's borders. The NATO forces are flying reconnaissance right up to the borders. They're going as close as they possibly could without violating that airspace where the Russians are going to shoot them down. And the notion of a no-fly zone, which has been tossed around by all sorts of American politicians and European politicians, that what that really means is a declaration of World War III, where instead of containing the war to Ukraine, which is what's happening now because the West is they're help supplying targeting information. Their satellites are doing all the reconnaissance, and they're giving all of that to Ukraine. They're throwing weapons at Ukraine and sending mercenaries into Ukraine, but they're not officially joining the war, and they're keeping it limited to within the borders of Ukraine. But if those limits fall and suddenly it breaks out of outside of Ukraine, if the West, the NATO forces start going into Ukraine, such as by declaring a so-called no-fly zone, what that really means is that the Russians, who have their own no-fly zone in Ukraine right now, will have to shoot down any American planes that try to enforce any no-fly zone, and vice versa. And both sides would target each other's anti-aircraft stuff, which that's, of course, in the neighboring countries. The Western American anti-aircraft batteries and so on are outside the borders of Ukraine, and Russia would have to attack them. So that would basically mean World War III. So that's one route that the war could expand. And then it's also possible that Russia might decide to invade Baltic countries too. That's another possibility. It just really depends how things go. But Russia sees this as an existential situation. It's defending its very existence. It will stop at nothing, and the West may or may not understand that. And if it doesn't, then we're in serious trouble.
Well, I'll let Rashid. Rashid, do you have a question that you want to ask?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Russia got something called the S-400 and the S-500. The politicians of America, they're not military men, and they can't see what's going on. If they do that, they're gonna, as it said, go and eat something and not know what they really gonna have. Do you agree?
Yeah, the Russian air defense systems are said to be much better than the American equivalents. So that's right. That's where the Russians obviously have a lot of confidence right now, or they wouldn't be doing this. And so the reason they have the confidence is that they have these advanced weapon systems, starting with those air defense systems you mentioned, but also including their hypersonic missiles and their enhanced nuclear deterrent. So no longer can the United States pretend that it's going to get away scot-free if it launches a unilateral nuclear first strike against Russia. So Russia has built up its military over the past several years, and that's why it's willing to take the risks that it's taking now. But it's, it may be a risk, but at the same time, from the Russian standpoint, it's inevitable, and it had to happen sometime. And at this point, because they have these weapon systems, they have the confidence to go ahead and draw the line now.
It took a while for me to get
I want to read
online.
something to you. Go ahead. If you have another question, go ahead, and then I'll read this because I want him to comment on this report coming on. So go ahead and ask him a question.
Like I say, my computer messed up a little before, and what's happening with Imran Khan in Pakistan? I know they want him out.
Yeah.
Don't answer that one yet. Don't answer that one yet. I wanted to come back to that one. I wanted us to move to that because that was on my mind. Rashid, I started to start the show with that, but that's on my mind, and I want to give it a little bit more than just a glance. Hold on to that one, Professor Barrett. But there's an article out in Russia Today, and the title of it is "U.S. Dollar at Risk of Losing Dominance." Wall Street Bank warns, and then it says the freezing of Russia's foreign reserves has undermined trust in the greenback. Goldman Sachs economist says the US dollar is dealing with some of the same challenges that the British pound faced in the early 1900s before it went into decline. Goldman Sachs said in a research note released on Thursday. The Wall Street Bank warns that the greenback could lose its global dominance. Now, I said that I read that to say that I was reading an article by some financial time I think it was the Financial Times. It could have been some financial magazine. They were saying that the yuan has the sky's is the limit for the Chinese yuan now, and they did a study saying that the yuan is getting more and more acceptable to other nations around the world. But America's policies like this, these arrogant policies like this, isn't she holding a gun to her own head and shooting herself in the head, foot, and arm?
It looks kind of that way, doesn't it? Yeah, Michael Hudson is an economist who's written about this stuff, and from his perspective, it looks like this could be the end of the dollar dominance that's been the financial backbone of the U.S. empire. So he says that even Putin and the Russians may have actually gamed this out, using game theory before they went ahead with the Ukraine action. They knew they were going to be sanctioned, and they knew what the result of that would be. First, it's going to destroy confidence in the dollar. All these other countries see that, wait a minute, if our government does something that the Americans don't like, they could freeze our money, or basically steal our money. And that means that putting our assets in dollars where they could be stolen is probably not a good idea. We're going to get out of dollars. We'll go somewhere else. We'll go to precious metals or the yuan or what have you. So that destruction of confidence in the dollar is also coupled with the Russians insisting on selling their energy and increasingly other products too in rubles. And that also is not only keeping the price of the ruble up, but that's a threat to the dollar as well, because the dollar has been called the petrodollar since the early 1970s, when Kissinger and Nixon cut a deal with the Saudis to sell Saudi energy only in dollars, and then the other Gulf states followed suit, meaning that all the countries around the world that need energy, which is most of them, have to buy it in dollars, and that creates a demand for dollars that makes the dollar valuable, so that the Americans, or the Federal Reserve, owned by the oligarchs, can just keep printing as much money as they want and forcing people to take it. And that's what financed the expansion of the empire. Now we have 800 military bases all around the world. And the reason we're able to pay for that is that we're paying with these dollars, we can print as much as we want of. But now, since the confidence is being undermined and increasingly the energy business is getting out of dollars, the Russian ruble move, this kind of judo move that Putin did, that's now rebounding over in the Middle East, where the Saudis and the Emiratis refused to take Joe Biden's phone call when he was going to tell them to start pumping more oil to bring the price back down. They refused to take his phone call. And the Saudis are saying that they're going to start selling oil in yuan, and Emiratis have been indicating that as well. So if that happens, then it looks like it may be curtains for the petrodollar empire. And that way the Russians could actually win without even firing a shot, at least beyond Ukraine.
And what do you think that is going on? Because the Western press, I have my own sources telling me something, but I want to know your opinion on who are the people trapped in the steel mill in Mariupol, because the French president continues to make pleas to Moscow to allow helicopters to land, to fly these important so-called advisors from the West out. Who do you think these people are?
Well, I don't know. We know there are a bunch of people from the Azov Battalion, the neo-Nazi wing of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. That's their headquarters. Mariupol is their headquarters, and they've made that steelworks their last stand. And so the leadership of this critically important branch of the Ukrainian military, the Nazi wing, the Azov battalion, which is specifically being targeted by Russia. So they're in there. And of course, the French and the Western side wants to evacuate those people so they can regroup and fight the Russians elsewhere. But who knows whether there are Western advisors in there with them who are also trapped. And if that's the case, we may or may not find out because, of course, if their bodies end up being found by the Russians, maybe the Russians will publicize it. Yeah, that's kind of a mystery. And I haven't really seen any reports that would indicate specifically who that would be. But we do know that the NATO advisors have been all over Ukraine since 2017. It was actually, again, as I said before, under Trump that Ukraine was brought in as a de facto, although not official, member of NATO. And these Western trainers and Western equipment went in there and revamped the Ukrainian military and turned it into a NATO military. So there very likely are NATO advisors in there. It's not at all beyond the realm of possibility. And just because we're not seeing much about this in the Western media doesn't mean it isn't true.
Okay. Rashid, you have anything to say as we pivot to what you wanted to say?
No, as I was thinking while you were talking, that the American leadership is brain dead. You cannot sanction your friends and your enemies and expect them to continue with the dollar. Who is actually running stuff? A bunch of idiots in Washington?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If it plays out the way it looks like it's going to play out, and the dollar goes down, and the U.S. empire goes down, people are going to be scratching their heads and say, "Why did the Americans shoot themselves in the foot like this?"
It's like the enemy is not Putin, but Biden. It
Right.
looks like that.
Well, there's been all kinds of speculation, of course, about who's really running the Western Empire and who they're loyal to. We know they're not loyal to ordinary people, that's for sure. But why have they done all of these self-destructive moves? And there's one theory of the sort of the enemy within theory that says that, well, who are these people? They're neocons, the people doing the military decisions about Ukraine and the larger strategic stuff in general. It's been dominated by neocons since 9/11. 9/11 was a neocon coup d'etat. The Straussian neoconservatives blew up the World Trade Center, got away with this big lie, and emerged in total control of U.S. strategic policy, near total control. They couldn't, the most extreme wing of them couldn't get their direct all-out war on Iran that they wanted, but they've been pushing, they've gotten most of what they wanted, and they got everything they wanted in Ukraine. So who are these neocons? Well, they're all Jewish. They're all extreme Zionists who are undoubtedly far more liberal to Israel, or far more devoted to the interests of Israel than to the United States. So that's one aspect of this. And if you go to people like Sheikh Imran Hussein, who's the leading Muslim eschatologist, he would tell you that the Israelis took over. So it's not even about keeping American supremacy. What happened is that on 9/11, the Zionist empire took over from the American empire, and they've been running everything for the benefit of Israel ever since. So according to that way of seeing things, the suicidal American policy of attacking the Muslim world after 9/11 and destroying all of these countries that were enemies to Israel but would have been friends to the United States was really all about helping greater Israel expand, saving it from from the threats around it, and giving it the chance to become the dominant force in its region. And it's trying to do that now, of course, cutting these deals with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Moroccans and other countries like that. And then with the Ukraine war, that may turn out disastrously for the U.S., but it's also somewhat helpful to Israel because it takes Russia out of Syria. Russia had been getting to the point where it was quite capable of telling the Israelis that they have to stop going after the axis of resistance targets in Syria. They have those air defenses you guys mentioned. And now Russia is forced to put all of its effort into Ukraine, and then Israel can pretend to be the neutral broker and be relatively friendly to Russia. And that's what they've been doing. And so it's helped Israel in those ways. It's also forced up to 200,000 Ukrainians who have eligibility for Israeli citizenship to head for Israel. So Israel just got a whole bunch more so-called Jews. Now, all these people are particularly Jewish, of course, to continue their ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. So Israel won with the 9/11 false flag and the 9/11 wars that followed. Israel is gaining from this Ukraine fight, and the United States strategically isn't. The U.S. empire looks like it's very possibly going to completely collapse thanks to this idiotic decision to poke the Russian bear in Ukraine and provoke a war there. So you can ask, who's benefiting here, and some like Sheikh Imran Hussein would say it's the Israelis. Another way of looking at it, though, is some other folks say that no, it's really just hubris or pride and arrogance. These stupidity and arrogance go together, and these neocons are extremely stupid, extremely arrogant. They think they can get away with anything. Their answer to any situation is bigger lies and bigger wars, more provocation. They honestly think that they can take on Russia and China and Iran all at once. And so why even bother with dividing and conquering? So it's some combination of those two things. Either Zionists who don't care about the U.S. empire as long as Israel comes out strong when the U.S. empire collapses, or just arrogant idiots.
Well, while everybody is focused on Ukraine, it seems like there's still a buildup of arms and troops in the Middle East, doesn't it? And there's a explosion of violence and tension in there. What do you think is going to happen? Because Israel, in certain ways, she's acting like America, or vice versa. How America is acting towards Russia, this is how Israel is acting towards the Muslim population of the Middle East. Where do you think that's going to lead things?
Yeah, there's a relationship there, of course, and yeah, the Israelis are very tight with Saudis and Emiratis in their war on Yemen. Although we did just get a Ramadan truce, and I hope that endures. The Saudis broke the last truce, so we'll see what happens with this one. But yeah, the Israelis have been extremely arrogant historically in all sorts of ways, and right now their biggest threat, they think, is this axis of resistance, which has a center of gravity in Tehran. And so the Israelis are spoiling for a fight with Tehran, and they've been the extremists among them especially have been pushing for war with Iran. They know they can't win it by themselves, though, so they've been trying to trick the United States into going into Iran. And with 9/11, they did trick the United States into going into Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and Somalia and of course Lebanon, and so they got a lot of what they wanted. But the American military guys drew the line in the sand with the case of Iran. They said, no, I know you neocons blew up the Trade Center so that we would take out Tehran. We know the reason that you had us go into Iraq and Afghanistan was to surround Iran so that we could then enforce regime change on Iran, even at the price of a huge war. But we're not going to do it because we've war gamed it, and the Iranians win. I mean, the only way we can quote unquote win would be to just kill everybody in Iran with nuclear weapons, and then we still lose if we do that, because we lose all of our reputation in the world, we lose our soft power. So we can't do that. And so the neocons didn't get their war on Iran. The Israelis, some of them wanted that war. Netanyahu worked tirelessly to drag the Americans into a war in Iran during his tenure. And now today, there's still some of that conflict where the American wing, which of the empire, which again is top heavy with Zionists, that group under Biden, they think, and probably correctly, that the Iran nuclear deal is advantageous to the United States empire and ultimately advantageous to Israel as well. So they're trying to reinstitute that nuclear deal, whereas the hardline extremist sort of Zionist group, especially in Israel, doesn't want that to happen. They are afraid that any kind of opening between Iran and the U.S. and the West will ultimately help Iran become the most powerful country in the region, at which point, when it's dedicated to the liberation of Palestine, and so having the most powerful country in the region, which gets along with the whole world, including the West, being dedicated to the liberation of Palestine, that's a non-starter from the Israeli perspective. So there's a conflict between the extremists in Israel and then the more reasonable Zionists in the United States, who say, well, we can cut deals with Iran, we can try to split Iran off a little bit from Russia and China, and limit their nuclear program, and all of this will be fine. That Iran's not really going to go after you Israelis, but the Israelis are paranoid, and that's their job. So yeah, it's an interesting situation. Of course, then with regard to Yemen, we have to say that almost 400,000 civilians have been killed in this Saudi war of aggression against Yemen. It's backed by the U.S. and its puppet states like the UK and the other European countries. So they've slaughtered almost 400,000 Europeans. They've been a lot less careful than Russia has been in Ukraine in their bombing. They use bombs from high altitudes that are not very accurate, so they end up killing all kinds of civilians, hitting civilian targets. And so this mass slaughter in Yemen, that's just orders of magnitude bigger than anything that's happened in Ukraine, has gotten zero publicity practically in the West. Nobody cares. Nobody's waving the Yemeni flag everywhere. It's hypocrisy and perhaps racism. Let's face it. It does seem that all of those white faces of those poor Ukrainian victims sells better in the Western media than the Yemenis. Nobody seems to care about the Yemenis. So it's another aspect of this that's just really disgusting, the way the media is inciting this hysteria over Ukraine when it's been completely silent about this genocide in Yemen.
Now, since you were talking on that line of thinking, why is it that the media did not cover a few days ago that the U.S. ambassador to Israel said that even if the United States came out openly and said, even if the United States does sign the JCPOA and does agree with that, it still is non-binding to Israel. Israel does not have to conform to that, and she can move on this Iran if she thinks that they pose a threat.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
That's crazy.
Here's the United States. Yeah,
we agree that they're not the sharpest bulbs in the briar patch up in Washington.
Oh yeah, it's I don't know where these people. It seems like in American politics, they have to kiss up to Israel at every level, and even if their policy may be diverging a little tiny bit from what Israel wants, they have to say all kinds of stupid things to ingratiate themselves with the Israelis. So that seems to be what's going on here. But really, the U.S. telling Israel it has a green light to attack Iran anytime, even as the U.S. is signing this treaty with Iran and is working to open up relations and remove sanctions. I don't know. I mean, if I were in Tehran, I'm not sure I would even be in favor of the JCPOA, even though it's going to help Iran's economy in the short run, at least. Dealing with these vipers, it could come back to bite you. They might be better off just continuing what they've been doing. And but hey, I don't know. I'm not setting policy in Tehran.
What makes the Iranians think that it's going to be any different than what they did before? They had the JCPOA and they didn't fully implement it. This time, what is different? If you sign it and say, for instance, a Trump get back in there, he's just going to throw it over again. As Putin and them said, Americans are non-agreeable.
That's right.
What makes them think that they're going to fulfill their word this time?
Yeah, that's true. The Americans are obviously non-agreement capable, and the Iranians can't get. There are no assurances that the Americans could give them that the next administration won't just tear up the deal again like Trump did. So why would the Iranians bother signing it? Well, I think the answer, actually, I wrote an article about this for this month's Crescent International. The answer is that Iran benefits in the short run. So Iran has a few more years to benefit from lifting sanctions. And so I think what Iran insists on with this nuclear deal right now is not so much the guarantee that it won't be torn up again, because there's no way that guarantee could ever be given. And if the Americans did say that, they'd be lying. So instead, what Iran is demanding is that this deal come with immediate and verifiable lifting of all sanctions. See, that's what they didn't get last time. It wasn't just that Trump tore it up. It was also that Obama didn't fully respect it. What Obama said was, okay, we're going to lift this little sanction over here and that little sanction over there. This is after the JCPOA was implemented, and they're supposed to lift all the sanctions. Instead, Obama says, well, we're getting rid of that sanction here and this sanction there, but we're going to keep these sanctions over here. And those are not nuclear sanctions. Those are sanctions about your rocket program or whatever. So Obama didn't come close to lifting all the sanctions. And that was another sticking point in these negotiations. So as I understand it, the Iranians are being very hardcore about demanding that this time they want all sanctions immediately ended as of right now. The deal ends the second that it's signature on the page, sanctions are up, sanctions are gone. And the second we see that there's a sanction still in place, deals up, no deal. So that's what the Iranians are insisting on now, I think. And the reason that they're doing that is so there will be the sanctions relief, and that will help the Iranian economy, which is really struggling. Iran got clobbered with COVID, deliberately, of course. It was a biological weapon attack, U.S. bio attack on China and Iran. And so Iran really got clobbered, and their economy got hurt, and they need some short-term relief. And so the JCPOA will give that to them. And so even if the deal gets torn up in a few years, they'll get a couple of years of sanctions relief, which will be to their benefit. So I think that's why they're doing it.
But does the leadership in Iran realize that America does not yield? She doesn't know how to stop. And once she has you in her sight to make war on, she will go to lengths. Think about this. They never forgot Muammar Gaddafi kicked out the U.S. base in Libya. They never forgot that. And they planned and plotted for decades to get back at him. And they do that to everyone. They did it to Hugo Chavez and all of the people whom they deem as their enemies or their rivals. What preparations are Iran making militarily to rebuff what will be a military attack coming? Because I don't see America backing away from. I think what she does, she gives you a smile and a pat on the back while she prepares to take you. And once she is in a position where she thinks that it's beneficial for her to come out on top, then she moves on you. What is Iran doing to prevent the slaughter of a U.S. coalition or a Israeli attack on her?
Well, Iran is building a non-nuclear deterrent. They've got rockets now and drones, especially the rockets, that they're extremely accurate, they're very fast, and the American defenses can't stop them. And that was proved in the aftermath of the assassination of General Soleimani, when the Iranians told the Americans, they were very polite. They said, we're going to hit this base, to get your people to safety, and we're going to hit this base in 10 minutes or something like that. So quickly, Americans ring the alarm. Everybody dives for shelter down in the basement bomb shelter. And the Iranian missile comes in exactly where they said it was going to come. The U.S. defenses can't stop it. And boom, that whole base is destroyed. And the Americans, who survived only thanks to the Iranians being kind enough to give them enough warning to get them down to the shelter, the Americans all ended up with these concussions and stuff, brain injuries, but they survived. So Iran has shown with that, as well as with its testing and so on, that its rocket force is unstoppable. And so if anybody goes after Iran in a big enough way, Iran can retaliate with these rockets, and they can rain down death and destruction on the American bases in the region. They can get the ships. They can hit American ships. Every American ship in the Gulf is within range of Iranian anti-ship missiles that are dug in really deeply in the mountains on their side of the Gulf. And then Iran can actually hit Israel with these rockets too. And Iran could devastate Israel. Iran could spew radioactive waste all over Israel by targeting Dimona if they had to. So Iran has a pretty powerful deterrent, even without nuclear warheads on those rockets. And that's why Iran hasn't been taken out. The Atlantic magazine did a war game back in 2003, when after 9/11, they were saying, real men go to Tehran. That's what this is really all about, is regime change in Iran. But they ran the war game, and Iran won. And there was no way that the Americans could win, short of just, nuking all of Iran, which turns out to be a Pyrrhic victory. Again, the U.S. loses its empire out of shame and disgrace if it does that. So the Iranian non-nuclear deterrent has been strong enough so far to prevent a really big military attack. Now, what the Americans are up to now, I think, is that the Biden gang, which is basically the Obama gang, they are people who saw that the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were disastrous for the United States. And so they have a different policy. Their idea is to destabilize and do regime changes and do it sneakily from within the country. And so they tore apart Syria by instigating a civil war. And they did the same thing really with Ukraine. That 2014 coup d'etat was also under Obama. And that was an attempt to trigger, basically it did trigger a civil war in Ukraine. So by exploiting these fissures in countries that are targeted, the Americans think that they can get their way. And they want regime change in Tehran, just like the hardcore Zionists who want to go to war. Well, the Obama and Biden gang, what they want to do is they want to do all kinds of color revolution type stuff in Iran. They think that the younger generation in Iran isn't as religious and is, disillusioned with the Islamic Republic. And they think they can get regime change by targeting Iran for these kinds of CIA coup d'etat type operations, kind of like with Mossadegh in 1953, only it would be updated to the color revolution era. So that's their plan to try to go after Iran at that level. And so the Iranians, they have to not only build that rocket deterrent, but they also have to figure out how to prevent these CIA operations within their country, building up fifth columns and traitors who might try to organize a color revolution.
Are the Iranians about to purchase warplanes from China or Iran, to your knowledge?
I don't really know that much about what foreign military equipment Iran is getting. I'm not sure they're even very public about it. I know the Russians at some point made a deal for some air defenses, but I don't think the Russians have sold Iran the most advanced air defenses. And now they might. In fact, now with the Ukraine war being an existential threat to Russia, and then indirectly to China, because if Russia goes, then China goes too, we might see Russia and China stepping up and selling Iran even more advanced equipment.
Now, I want to ask you this, and I know Rashid want to chime in too, but I want to ask you these things about Russia's policy, because even as we talk about America's insane policy, we have to also shed a little light on some policies that didn't make a lot of sense from Russia's side. Why didn't Russia sell Assad the S-400 or Iran the S-400? These are allies, or these are people who stood against the empire. Yet they sold to Turkey, and they are offering Turkey fifth generation warplane, Su-30, but they have yet to upgrade Syria's air fleet or even give them to Iran, who we know that America wants to take out, because as they stated in one of their policy things, that is Afghanistan and Iran is the underbelly to Russia and China. And if they can get in through there, they can weaken Russia and China. And on top of that, I'll end with this. Why did Russia stop the Donbass region when they were about to take? They could have taken Kiev, but they stepped in. Russia would have been spared all of this stuff that they're going through now if they would not have halted the onslaught from the counteroffensive when the revolution took place in the Ukraine years ago.
So the first question I totally understand. Okay, and so maybe I'll just answer that one first. So the Russians, I think, have been reluctant to sell China, or rather to Iran and Syria their S-400s and perhaps other things as well. Not so much out of fear of provoking the U.S. itself, but in hopes of trying to keep something less than total enmity going with Israel. See, the moment the Russians give Iran and Syria S-400s and draw the line and say, that's it, Israel, you can't no more going after Iranian targets in Syria, then that's a huge setback for Israel. And Israel would immediately decide, they would call Russia a total enemy at that point. They would basically go on the warpath against Russia. And so if Israel goes on a warpath against Russia, that means also that the United States probably does too. The Israeli lobby has power in the United States. And I think the Russian, chess players think that's a bad move. They want to have a little bit of wiggle room with Israel. Israel and Russia don't get along too well because Russia saved Syria and has been working with Iran. but they don't want to turn it into a relationship where it's just 100%, enemy. They're not ready to make Israel their all-out enemy. But now, of course, with this war in Ukraine, they've made the Americans their all-out enemy. Israel is trying to sort of play both sides, but it's actually behind the anti-Russia problems, really, if you really get down to it. So maybe the Russians at some point will realize that when they, if they're going to war against the United States, they really have to be going to war against Israel as well. At that point, they might start selling the S-400s and other things to Syria and Iran. And of course, I would be very much in favor of that personally.
And the other
part, other question,
the other part is, why did Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership stop? After the 2014 coup.
2014.
And the Donbass region, they rebelled, and they mounted a counteroffensive as Kiev was trying to take it back, and they were beating Kiev, the government in Kiev, and they were they were taking the fight to them, and Russia intervened and stopped it. If Russia had not intervened and stopped it, it would have just thrown more weight behind the Donbass region. It would have prevented this thing that she is now in Ukraine about.
Well, you might be right. Putin said that we should have done this a long time ago, and maybe that's what he meant. I don't know. On the other hand, there may have been sound strategic reasons. Maybe at that point, the Russian nuclear deterrent wasn't fully, in place. The Russians have been scrambling really hard to try to make sure the Americans realize that the Americans cannot do a unilateral first strike against Russia and remove all of Russia's nuclear deterrent. So the U.S. wins nuclear World War III. That's the American policy, is to be able to win nuclear World War III, and indeed to win it. And the Americans have been pushing all of these kinds of so-called defensive systems that are really aimed at, nobody has a defensive system that can stop incoming nuclear missiles in large numbers. But the Americans are building these super fast, accurate, stealth-type attack systems that can hit the Russian nuclear bases in a first strike and knock out, let's say, 95% of Russia's nuclear capacity. But then there's 5% left, and that's still a lot. And so then if the Russians try to launch that in retaliation, that's where the American defense systems need to be able to stop 5% of Russia's nuclear missiles. They know they could never stop all of them, but they think if they can take out almost all of them in a nuclear first strike, then their defenses could stop what little bit is left. So the Americans are working to get that kind of first strike capability against Russia. And Russia in 2014 may not have been confident that the Americans wouldn't think that they could get away with that. So that means the Russians maybe had to really pussyfoot around and be really careful in 2014. And now they've brought online these kinds of hypersonic missiles that are unstoppable, this submarine weapon that launches a gigantic nuclear warhead underwater right off the coast, and that's the end of the coastal cities. Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C. are gone, and that's totally unstoppable. So now the Americans, who are of course horrified by this and say, "Oh, the Russians aren't playing; they're not playing fair." Well, what do you expect them to do if you're trying to do a nuclear first strike against their country? Come on. So anyway, I think the Russians may have needed those extra years to beef up their nuclear deterrent. So now they're no longer in a position where if push comes to shove.
I think what Rashid was talking about.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think what Rashid was talking about, I remember watching RT on a Sputnik, and they were a couple of analysts were laughing because back in 2014, they had the Ukrainian army surrounded, and they was getting ready to go in and polish them off. And Putin made them stop because the analysts were saying that in a couple of weeks, these rebels could actually be in Kiev and having Yanukovych and them in jail. And Putin stopped them. I even remember one of the generals that I was watching on the Sputnik radio, listening to on Sputnik radio, one of the generals saying, it is a mistake for us not to polish these guys off. They're just going to rearm and come back at us. That's what Brother Rashid was talking about.
Right. And what I was suggesting is that if the Russian-supported Donbass rebels had actually been in a position to take Kiev, then the Americans might have basically said, no, back off. In fact, maybe they did. Maybe they got on a hotline to Putin and, said back off or else. I don't know. But that's my sense, is that Russia didn't have the confidence. And probably the main reason was the nuclear deterrent. But again, we did hear Putin recently say that, we should have done this a long time ago. And that could be interpreted as maybe he's questioning the wisdom of what they did back then.
I think.
Let me ask one.
I have to say this, and I'm gonna let you get before I forget this. I have to say this. I don't think it was much of whether or not Russia did not have their nuclear deterrent in place. I think it was more appeasement, because they still, I think Russia and the leadership still felt that they were part of the collective West, or wanted to be integrated into the collective West. And if they had pushed further on in Ukraine, that would have just killed it all. I believe that's what why Putin is now second guessing the decision he made in 2014.
Yeah, that's very possible. I think that's a very good interpretation. In fact, if we tried to debate this, you might win the debate.
Go ahead, Rashid.
Okay, now here's another scenario that you might think about, the reason why Israel is pushing in the Ukraine. There are a whole lot of Jews in Ukraine and Russia. This right here brings, like you say, a lot of them get out of there and bring them to Israel.
Yeah, that's right.
They are whole. Even the people that's starting all of the problem, the Victoria Nuland and Brignesh Bernici, they're all from that region. Jewish people from that region, and they hate Russia. They hate Russia with a passion. So stir up this trouble and get more people to come from, Jews to come from all of those lands and populate Israel more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, I mentioned there are supposedly 200,000 Ukrainians that could qualify as Israeli citizens. Not all of them think of themselves as Jewish, but some of these people might have, like, the great uncle of their cousin or something was Jewish or something like that. But so there are like 200,000 potential Israeli citizens there, and probably a lot of them are already en route to Israel, already in Israel. So yeah, that is a big factor, as I mentioned earlier. And then you're right that Nuland and the Kagans, and she's part of that family, and this whole neocon group that's been put in charge of Ukraine policy and Russia policy is a bunch of Jewish Russia haters whose ancestors came from the Ukraine and the Pale of Settlement area. And they, remember pogroms, and they hated the Tsar. Jews were at war for 100 years with the Tsar, and then a certain group of communist Jews essentially took over Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution. So there's a whole history there. And just like Brzezinski was put in charge of America's Russia policy, even though he was from a Polish minor nobility family and hated Russia for that reason, now the people running the Russia policy are these Jews who have their reasons for hating Russia. And I wonder why American leadership, if there is such a thing, doesn't stop and ask itself, is it really in our interest to put these people with their ethnic hatreds in charge of Russia policy? But let's face it, the American policy has been dominated by Israel and the Jewish lobby for a long time. It's that Jewish lobby has been extremely powerful in the U.S. They stole American nuclear weapons starting in the 50s, and they helped build Israel's nuclear program through just blatant theft of American nuclear material, and totally got away with it. They have utter impunity. And that just shows the kind of power that this underground ethnically Jewish organized crime organization has always had. But they pretty much openly took over the U.S. with their 9/11 coup d'etat. And I guess that's partly why these radical anti-Russia Jewish neocons are in charge of Ukraine policy.
And speaking of that, that leads right back to Ukraine. What do you think about this so-called Zelensky guy? who came out of nowhere and ran on a platform of reconciliation with Russia and has done everything in the opposite of that.
Yeah, what's with Zelensky? Well, I mean, a guy who plays pianist, plays piano with his male organ. Maybe kind of what he plays the organ with. Yeah,
I forgot about that one.
yeah, he's quite a character, isn't he? He allegedly has some kind of drug issue as well.
Yes.
These celebrities apparently often have a weakness for white powder. And so he's some kind of a weird character. Kolomoisky, I guess, is oligarch that kind of owns him. So these frontmen, these oligarchs rule their countries. They rule places through frontmen, and sometimes they get really screwed up frontmen to rule countries through. People like Yeltsin was an alcoholic, and who knows what other weaknesses he had. And so he misruled Russia for 10 years, and male life expectancy dropped 8 years, which is the equivalent of when you lose a really horrible war. Oligarchs pick some real losers sometimes to run countries. George W. Bush, I guess, might be considered another example. He had a taste for the white powder himself. Indeed, he'd actually been arrested for dealing, apparently, and that all got scrubbed somehow. And George W. Bush also allegedly had some kind of a fetish with child prostitutes at a Caribbean island. It may or may not have been Epstein's. And that had something to do with why George H.W. Bush invaded Panama, because apparently Noriega had threatened the Bush family that, give me a bigger cut of the dope money, or I'm going to release these photographs of W in that brothel. And H.W.
that would get you invaded.
Yeah, that's the rumor about what one of the factors behind the Panama invasion was. So, bottom line, these oligarchs pick some real interesting characters to front for them, and Zelensky is a good example of that. And why he changed his policy, why he run on a let's repair relations with Russia platform, and then do the opposite, is he's owned by the oligarchs, and they tell him what to do. And then also, let's remember, it's not just the oligarchs themselves, but also these neo-Nazi groups, which are in bed with the oligarchs, of course. They are really nasty people. And if they say, you do what we want or you're dead, they mean it. And it does appear that some of these gangster neo-Nazi types have basically said that to him. So Zelensky may feel like he's been made an offer that he can't refuse.
Yeah. Well, there was reports about him having upwards of $1.6 billion in offshore accounts and stuff like that. And why do you think the media in the West, with all the censorship on everything else that you say, why is the media back in the United States in training, arming, and giving political and military cover and shelter to, and intelligence to, neo-Nazis?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. The media is dominated by people who are from ethnic Jewish backgrounds, and they may not be very religious, but they're still loyal to the tribe at some level, and they have their own way of thinking, conditioned by their backgrounds. So why do those people give all of this cover for these neo-Nazis? And then why did Jewish oligarchs, and then even the Jewish president Zelensky, play ball with these neo-Nazis? And I guess the answer is that Nazism, the Nazi movement, has never been as purely anti-Jewish as most people think. That's not really the basis of the Nazi movement. It's one incidental part of Hitler's movement in Germany was, we're going to clean out this place from the Jews who run everything. And there was a certain anti-Jewish racism along with the rest of the Nazi racism. But the Nazi movement has never been just about hating on Jews. It's much more than that. And for instance, the reason that the German Nazis were down on Jews was primarily that they didn't like the Bolsheviks over in Russia. And the Bolsheviks were mostly Jews. The people who dominated the Bolsheviks at that time were maybe 70, 80, 90% Jewish. And so the Germans kind of put that two and two together and said, these horrible Bolsheviks who are threatening us are Jews, and we got to get rid of this Jewish Bolshevik threat. So they kind of collapsed that into one thing. So anyway, the Nazi folks over in Ukraine have been able to sort of subdue their anti-Jewish tendencies, and they are, they're anti-Jewish too, like any good Nazi, but they're mostly anti-Russian. And let's face it, World War II was not between the Nazis and the Jews. It was more between the Germans and the Russians. They were the two countries that fought the hardest in World War II. And if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography, Hitler, he may have a few uncomplimentary things to say about Jews, but he never planned any kind of genocide against Jews. You read Mein Kampf, there's nothing about that. There's nothing about we're going to get rid of the Jews. Nothing. But Mein Kampf does have a whole chapter dedicated to how we are going to invade and ethnically cleanse and colonize the lands of the Slavs, especially Russia. That's the chapter called Eastern Policy towards the end of Mein Kampf. So Hitler's Mein Kampf includes his program for committing genocide against Slavs and Russians, who are called an inferior race. That's the direct translation from the Ralph Manheim translation of Hitler's Mein Kampf. So Nazis actually have a history of planning genocide against Russians, and they don't have a history of planning genocide against Jews. They did try to get the Jews out of Germany and German-controlled lands during World War II, but that wasn't primary. The primary goal of the Nazi movement was Lebensraum to the east, and that required genocide against Russians. So they hate Russians. And so when the Nazis marched through the Ukraine, there were some Ukrainians who had every reason to hate the Russians, because the Russian Bolsheviks had, through these idiotic policies, killed millions of Ukrainians in what's called the Holodomor. So when the German Nazis marched through Ukraine in their invasion of Russia after Operation Barbarossa, those Ukrainians sided with the Germans, and they started, dressing up as Nazis and joining the German battalions and fighting against the communist Russians. So that hatred of Slavs and Russians still exists in Ukraine, and it's especially centered in Galicia, which is in western Ukraine. So these Galician radical, racist, anti-Russian, anti-Slav neo-Nazis, they don't care much about Jews, really. And they're willing to work with Jewish billionaire oligarchs to further their designs against Russia. So that's what's really happening. So why does the Western media go along with this? Well, the Western media is anti-Russian too. These same Jews who dominate the Western media have ancestral hatreds of Russia, as we already talked about regarding Victoria Nuland and the Kagans and the neoconservatives. So no wonder the Jewish-dominated Western mainstream media is totally on board with this Nazi Russophobia, because they're Russophobic too. So now the Jews and the Nazis have something in common, and they're working together. And hey, that's a first, isn't it? No, it's not a first. That's been going on forever. The Jews and the Nazis were working together from the get-go, and the Rothschilds and their friends started both the world wars, and the main purpose was to create Israel. The Nazi movement was funded by people linked to the Rothschilds. The Bush family was part of this, that financial empire. So Jews and Nazis have ties going way back. They have common interests. Both the Jews and the Nazis, back before World War II, wanted to get the Jews out of Europe and into Palestine. So they had exactly the same objective. They worked together. They both wanted to chase the Jews out of Europe and throw them into Palestine. Well, guess what? They have the same objective today. The Israelis want more Israeli citizens. They want those 200,000 so-called Jewish Ukrainians to come to occupied Palestine. And the Nazis are happy with that too. Hey, we got rid of the Jews. We don't mind that. But mainly we want to kill Russians. And hey, you Jewish oligarchs are helping us kill Russians. And you Western media people are running cover for us as we go to kill Russians. So the Jews and the Nazis working together, it's been going on forever.
So now, Rashid, now we'll transition, because I know we don't want to keep him too much longer. He's been very gracious. But let's pivot to Asia now. And now you can talk about Pakistan. Rashid.
Oh, no, you can go on about what's going on with Imran Khan, and you think he will survive?
Yeah, Imran Khan is under fire right now, and apparently fears for his life, has totally had to revamp his security detail, because, and there's a connection here with Ukraine. The same people that engineered the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014 like the people who engineered the coups in Iran and Guatemala in 1953, 1954, and so many other places all over the world. Those people are targeting Imran Khan now. And as John Perkins says in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, first they try to make a deal, and they've already tried to make their deal with Imran Khan, and he won't take their deal. He's tilting towards China. So now they can send in the hitmen, the jackals or the asteroids is what they call them, and they can try to do a plane crash. They already killed, what is it, like at least 4 or 5 previous leaders of Pakistan have been murdered by the CIA, and Imran Khan knows that. So that's their first attempt. And then, of course, John Perkins says that if they can't kill the president who won't take their orders, then they'll do an invasion. Now, I don't think the U.S. is going to invade Pakistan anytime soon after what happened in Afghanistan. So the main issue here would be assassination. Well, of course, they're also doing a parliamentary regime change effort, which seems to have failed. And Imran Khan is screaming from the rooftops that the CIA is engineering this. And he's calling on patriotic Pakistanis, and especially the military, to resist this CIA regime change operation. So that's pretty interesting. And it's also interesting that the Western media has totally refused to cover this. And, here's Imran Khan just screaming from the rooftops about this, and we don't see anything about it in the mainstream media.
And I was recently told that the reason that he hasn't been deposed at this moment is because there's a split in the military leadership. America has some implants there that they thought that they could rely on, but there's other people who are in the leadership they want to exert Pakistan's sovereignty, and they see their future with Asia. And so there's a clash right now, and so there's maneuvering behind the scenes between both blocks. What do you think the outcome of that will be, especially with all of the clout that China presents, when China openly said that they did not like outside interference in the Pakistani affairs, and that China has tens of billions of dollars invested in Pakistan, with tens of billions more coming, and just gave them top of the line warplanes that outclass anything that America has given them.
Yeah, who knows how it'll play out? But it would be great if Pakistan's military, which has been the one institution that has tried to stand up for some semblance of the Pakistani national interests, as the corrupt politicians bought and paid for by oligarchs and Western interests have betrayed Pakistan over the years. And so once again, it's time for the Pakistani military to stand up and say no to these people who are threatening to assassinate their leader. And I would hope that this regime change effort would fail. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. There have been a number of these CIA regime change efforts that have failed. There have also been a bunch of them that have succeeded, at least for a while, although sometimes the short-term success equals long-term failure, as with Iran. In this case, though,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. I was getting feedback. And I was wondering if... Go ahead.
Yeah. All I can say is I don't really know how it's all going to play out, but I think there's a pretty good chance that this particular CIA regime change effort will fail.
I actually think that Imran
and what does
Khan,
that mean?
I actually think that Imran Khan is becoming more popular. I think that this is the blowback between what's going on. I think that with China's military behind Imran Khan, because as you said, $50 billion that China invested in the Belt and Road project for Pakistan, China behind him and pushing that, and all that investment is actually going to make him unstoppable.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's already got the advantage of his charisma, and he's very well spoken, has a big popular base. He's been a celebrity for ages before he became a politician, and he is widely regarded as being uncommonly honest as politicians go. So he has that as a start. And then, as you said, he's got this big Chinese investment behind him. So financially, the Chinese can offer a lot more than the West can. Of course, that was the case with Ukraine in 2014, too. And the Russians could offer a lot more than the West could. That's the whole reason that the West did the coup d'etat, was that, you know, the West said, here's the deal, you know, you buy our stuff, buy our energy and stuff, and here's what we'll give you. The Russians, you know, made their offer, and it was a lot better. And so the prime minister, the leader of Ukraine had at the time had to make a choice, and he chose the deal that was better for his people. And then he got overthrown in the CIA coup d'etat. So that's, of course, this parallel situation, what's happening in Pakistan. And Imran Khan is going to have to rally the people behind him and the key politicians behind him and have a really good security detail and stay out of small planes. And then maybe he can survive this.
But Imran Khan, one second, brother. Imran Khan, what's going on in Pakistan and Ukraine? Ukraine got the Israeli factor in there, right? Israeli is the one that had their hand over in Ukraine. They don't have it so much in Pakistan.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Israel does target Pakistan through their connections with India. But they're
not on the level of Ukraine.
That's right.
So on Press TV, there was an article that came out yesterday, and it says U.S. coup failure in Pakistan is a sign that the empire's days as hegemon are over. And it reads, the first couple paragraphs reads like this: an American political analyst and journalist says the U.S. coup failure against Pakistan Minister Imran Khan is a sign that the empire's days as hegemon are over. For the first time in the history of Pakistan's parliament, its members chanted "Death to America" as they rejected a non-confidence vote which sought to oust Prime Minister Khan, saying foreign powers are interfering in the country's democratic process. It says, Qasim Suri, the National Assembly Deputy Speaker, dismissed the no trust move against the Prime Minister on Sunday, terming it as contradictory to Article 5 of Pakistan's Constitution. What does that, if Pakistan, the people in Pakistan are now up in arms because they used to be, some of them used to be in the pockets of the Americans, and that's why regime change was possible. What does it say now that you have the parliament standing up screaming "Death to America," and at the same time, the Prime Minister Khan was very smooth and smart to, if not overcome the coup, at least delay it. What does that say about American power in today's geopolitical chess game?
Well, it does show that it looks like they may have lost Pakistan, which is huge, of course. And you know, the Americans are probably scratching their heads and saying, "Well, why did we help Pakistan get nuclear weapons, or at least look the other way?" And now we've lost them. But this reminds me a little bit of what happened with Erdogan, with that coup attempt against Erdogan. That was also another CIA coup attempt, and Erdogan managed to rally the people behind him and survive it. Now, I don't think he's at the level of Imran Khan in terms of being fully independent and honest. In fact, in terms of honesty, they're kind of opposites. Erdogan may be slightly less honest than your average politician, which is really saying something, whereas Imran Khan is definitely more honest than your average politician. But in any case, this does show the limits of the empire's power, that we may be reaching a point in the world when the Pakistani parliament is chanting "Death to America." You think you're over in Tehran or something at a revolutionary anniversary parade. I was in the middle of one of those ones. 5 million Iranians all chanting "Death to America." Oh, excuse me, are you American? Well, yeah. Hey, we don't mean you. But now it's in Pakistan too. So we've cursed to live in interesting times, but sometimes there are some good interesting times, and I guess that's good in Pakistan.
Well, speaking on that, I was thinking about Erdogan when you guys brought it up. Why is it that Erdogan always claims to be a defender of Islamic values and of the Muslims and claims to be the head of the Muslim world, yet Israel docked the international relief ship that time and killed a Turkish citizen? Nothing was done, just a protest. But Erdogan goes into Iraq, bombs Iraq constantly, and he has multiple bases in northern Iraq, and yet he is wreaking havoc on Syria, another Muslim country. We can see that he's fighting Muslim nations while he's saying that he is the protector and defender of Islam. How is that even? How can you even square that?
Yeah, Erdogan he's a very canny politician, and he's tried to position himself as the defender of Islam, and I think he did actually push back a little bit against the Israelis for a while, but he never totally cut them off or turned against them. And he plays both sides, all the time. That is, of course, that's one winning strategy. Is if you can play both sides, then you can't really lose. So he did that with the Israelis. You could argue that he stood up to some extent for Muslims by protesting against the coup d'etat in Egypt, where Sisi, with Zionist support, took over and kicked out the first honestly elected government in history, and then cracked down and murdered and tortured thousands, tens of thousands of people. So Erdogan has done the right thing here and there, and then prior to all of this, his economic policy was good. He was actually allowing trade with Iran, even though the Americans didn't approve of it. So Erdogan he's done some good stuff. He's cultivated the pro-Islam Turks, and that's been his power base. So he kind of positions himself as bringing back Islam to Turkey. Remember, Turkey suffered a cultural genocide. Islam was almost completely wiped out in Turkey. Ataturk, he destroyed mosques. He destroyed the Turkish alphabet. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if a Muslim took over as the dictator of the United States and ordered that all books written in the Roman script had to be destroyed, and from now on, Americans could only use the Arabic script to write in English? I mean, that would be the end of our whole history and culture. That's what happened in Turkey. They destroyed the entire library. The whole written output of Turkey was just destroyed in one stroke because it was too Islamic. So Erdogan is coming back now as part of a movement to bring Islam back in Turkey after it was almost destroyed. And so he poses as a defender of Islam. However, as a canny and seemingly not very honest politician, he plays both sides whenever he can. He's a survivor. He survived a U.S. coup attempt. He's survived enmity from the pro Ataturk wing in the Turkish military, and so I guess just like Putin can't completely turn against Israel because he has to limit the number of enemies he has and how angry the enemies are. I think that Erdogan uses the same strategy, and so that's why he's now cozying up to Israel again, even after he went through that period of turning against Israel and threatening it to no avail after the Mavi Marmara incident. So yeah, he's a survivor and a double. He's a politician, talks out of both sides of his mouth. He's a survivor. It's kind of too bad that the Turkish Islamic movement has him as its representative.
Okay, so I want to ask these, and I won't hold you much longer. I'm going to ask you some final questions, and Rashida ask you a couple final questions. My final question to you is, what do you see the landscape looking like as the dollar collapses in America and as tensions brew in the Middle East and in Asia and in Europe?
Well, if I have to make predictions, of course, it's always hard to know for sure what's coming, but I think it's very likely that we're facing a huge global economic downturn as the Ukraine wheat comes off the market, the Russian wheat comes off the market, or at least a lot of markets that used to get it, and the Russian energy, a lot of it comes off the market too, and so that's going to create a perfect storm, and we could have a lot of starving people and angry people, even in places where there aren't so many who are starving. And if the US dollar collapse really starts happening sooner rather than later, we could have a lot of angry people right here in the United States as well. Where that all goes, I don't know. I mean, I could imagine Trump or someone like Trump, coming back in a big way in the next round of presidential elections. That's a possibility. driven by popular anger about the horrible situation that's just about to crash down on us. So yeah, I hate to be a pessimist, but to me, the next few years actually look pretty bad. The empire, it's like when the U.S. empire collapses, that, in a way, that will be something that I'll of course have to welcome, right? I've been pretty disillusioned with the U.S. empire ever since I woke up to the truth about Vietnam and the Kennedy assassination back when I was a teenager. But there's that saying, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. And when I wish for that U.S. imperial collapse, and I have been pretty much for my whole life, when it happens, it's probably not going to be pretty, and there probably is going to be a lot of suffering involved. In the long run, though, I guess that's how it all works, and Allah's justice prevails in the long term and in the other world, if not also in this one.
Rashid, your final question.
What a choice. You got Trump on the other hand and Biden on the other hand. Both of them trying to destroy America. But what I would like to ask is the Yemen thing. How do you see that coming out between them and the Saudis? Do you think it's going to be the end of that? I personally think that the Saudis are not going to stop. Yemenis have to take over Riyadh. That's the only way I see it coming out.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're probably right. I could try to debate you and say, well, maybe things are different now because the empire is ending. The Saudis are selling their oil in yuan. They've broken with the empire. They're not taking Joe Biden's phone calls anymore. So maybe the Saudis realize that it's a new world. And in that new world, they'd be better off cutting their losses. They should have cut their losses 7 years ago, but now they really should cut their losses and have a negotiated solution to this war. Yeah, that would be nice. I would hope that could happen, but unfortunately, you're probably right. And probably the best outcome, of course, would be the Houthis taking Riyadh. And, we really need to liberate the holy places. I know this is considered a pretty strong statement by a whole lot of folks. Here in the U.S., a lot of our mosques are funded by the Saudis, but the fact is that they have not been acceptable custodians of the holy places, and they really need to go. So one way or another, Muslims of the world need to figure out how to put the holy places under responsible guidance, and that probably is going to require either a kind of a collective move by the Islamic world or some kind of military victory by the enemies of Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, your vision of the Houthis taking Riyadh, I'll cheer that on if it happens.
Now, we'd like to thank you for joining us. You're welcome here on this platform anytime. We hope that you have a blessed day. I'll contact you later. May Allah bless each and every one of my co-hosts, you and the audience that is viewing and that will view us. We thank you all for joining us. As always, we go out the same way we came in, with love, and we hope that this has enlightened you, this conversation, this discussion has enlightened you on geopolitical and world events, and that you may take this to heart and prepare yourself for what is in store for this world. On that note, I got to say, I love you, Mom.